challenged them, and she did so in ways her male equivalent, the mulatto, did not. Not only did she fuse black and white, African and European, in her own body and in those of her ever-multiplying and increasingly racially mixed descendants, whose growing numbers and diverse, unpredictable appearances challenged Europe's systems of racial difference. At the same time, she inspired sexual desire among white men in ways white men would not allow themselves to imagine mulatto men eliciting, either within themselves or among their white wives and daughters. Simultaneously black and white, desired and disdained, the mulatto was the quintessential liminal figure who incessantly destabilized the clear-cut distinctions so central to the liberal white male's sense of personal, social, and political order. Simultaneously essential and marginal to the liberal construction of political modernity, she penetrated 18th and 19th century colonial texts, the tabooed abject other who would not be effaced. Always multiply imagined, she assumed slightly different rhetorical forms and symbolic functions at different moments in time and in different revolutionary Atlantic cultures. Her analysis consequently requires a comparative approach. I will focus first on representations of the mulatto in 18th century Francophone and Anglophone texts. I will then turn to a more detailed analysis of a strikingly different text, a female-authored novel, Leonora Sansay's Zelka the Creole. In that way, we will be able to compare representations of the mulatto across genres, political texts and novels, and among Anglophone, Francophone, and U.S. texts, and most significantly, between male and female writers. The enigmatic mulatto, desirable and devouring. Now again, remember, if I'm going too quickly or using terms that you are not familiar with, you have an obligation to stop me and ask. That is your responsibility in this room. Otherwise, I'll just sail on, which probably would be a mistake. The mulatto is a hybrid, perhaps the most sexually and politically resonant hybrid imaginable. Let us begin our exploration of the mulatto with a very brief consideration of hybridity itself. Hybridity, Robert Young tells us, requires acts of radical disruption and forced fusion. It makes difference into sameness and sameness into difference, he argues, but in a way that, quote, the same no longer remains the same, the difference no longer simply different. Rather, he explains, hybridity involves a bizarre, binate operation in which each impulse is qualified against the other, forcing momentary forms of dislocation and displacement into a complex economics of agonistic retriculation. I had to look up most of those words. By which he means that clearly marked binary divisions are refused, are relinked in different ways. Lines of distinction are transformed, become jagged, disruptive patterns that, weaving in and around one another, defy easy deciphering. Racial difference and sameness, desire and aversion are reformed as radically new, highly unstable configurations. In the process, the profoundly dialectical nature of race and sexuality reveals itself, but without clearly defined constituting others to guard against, racial, sexual, and gendered categories become diffuse, boundaries blur, social order loses its biological determinate references. Perhaps Bolivar's democratizing fantasies are possible. What a suggestive way to begin an analysis of the mulatto and the challenges she posed to Enlightenment's understanding of the relation between the liberal citizen and his racialized others, as the revolutionary Atlantic became an ever more turbulent sea of political change and conflict. At first glance, the mulatto appears the diametrically opposite, the ideal constituting other to the white male colonizer. who embodied white expansion and domination. Female to his male, black to his white, passionate and instinctive to his reasoned moderation and self-control, she appeared to reaffirm his coherent sense of self, along with his exclusive claims to modernity and self-governance. But how clear were these lines demarcating her otherness? As already noted, she was the very embodiment of racial fusion, and the unpredictability of race is a social marker. Generation after generation of her racially mixed offspring assumed ever-changing and far from predictable forms. Moving back and forth across the color chart, they distressed and reperculated traditional understandings of white and black, self and other, order and disorder. But the mulatto distressed the clear lines of racial and social distinction not only by fusing races, far more dangerously as a sexually desirable and desiring image, she evoked the most destabilizing aspect of identity formation, the self's desire for its constituting other. What do I mean by this? Liberal individualism presumes a radical rupture between the self and others. The liberal subject theoretically stands alone, proud of his independence, his self-reliance. Repeatedly, he constitutes imagined others, figured along racial, gendered, class, or religious lines, constituting others whose differences confirm the boundaries that constitute the white liberal man's sense of self. But these others are, in the end, his own creations, the fantasized projections of his own fears and desires, extensions of his self or himself. How sharp, how confirming can the lines be that demarcate the individual as distinct from his own fears and desires? And desire is such a telling word. Figures of the forbidden, others fascinate and intrigue us, luring us down transgressive paths, evoking a complex pattern of disdain and desire. They refuse difference, retriculating it into new patterns of interdependence. And so the mulatto emerged on the pages of the 18th century male colonizing text, a sexually intriguing figure, enticing the white male colonizer into ever more complex sexual engagements and fantasies. An irresistible temptress who bewitched and enslaved her masters, she inverted the hierarchies on which colonial power rested, but of course only in the imagination of those masters. There she functioned as a scapegoat for sexual excesses, reckless extravagance, and irresponsibility that metropolitan writers repeatedly condemned the colonists for displaying. In the reality of plantation life, she remained an enslaved victim, a victim through her master's caprices. As Doris Garraway, a historian, actually a literary critic of sexual images of Saint-Domingue and Haiti during the 18th and 19th centuries, Garraway warns us it is important not to confuse male planters' sexual fantasies with the actual experiences of enslaved women. Slave women, Garraway continues, were increasingly poisoned and subjugated in absolute terms to white power desire. They were meant to exist both as wombs for more slaves and as sexual objects for their masters. The mulatto existed, therefore, not only on multiple Caribbean islands, but on multiple social and ideological registers. She was simultaneously an actual person, the property of her white owner, the daughter or granddaughter of some white person, possibly the concubine of another white planter. If the latter, she was in all probability the mother and grandmother of ever more complex mixed-race children, and consequently part of a demographic phenomenon that, growing steadily, became ever more socially and economically threatening. What do you do with people who cross boundaries of race in a world that is structured along racial distinctions? What does that do to this concept of white, to white privilege and white power in any of these Caribbean islands, or for that matter, in the United States? As such, she was feared by the very planters who exploited her. Finally, as we have already discussed, the mulatto existed as a simultaneously desired and detested fantasy of the white imaginary, a rhetorical construction, a tabooed and intriguing figure of the abject other. In all these forms, she assumed critical social functions. She was central to the functioning of European imperialism and political modernity during the Age of Revolution, and she will guide us to a better understanding of the paradoxes of liberalism today. Let us look at her first as she figured in the 18th century Francophone world, focusing principally on the writers of Emerita and Alexander Stanislas de Wulffen. I can write his name down because I have no idea how to pronounce him, although I've read him a lot. You see, if I write it here? Observers of slave society in Saint-Domingue. Saint-Domingue later gets renamed as Haiti. In Saint-Domingue during the critical years surrounding the French and Haitian revolutions. Both Saint-Domingue under the French was probably the richest, most productive plantation slave economy in the world, even more than Suriname or Brazil. And was called the Pearl of the Atlantic and produced immense wealth for France. So they were astute observers of slave society in Saint-Domingue during the critical years surrounding the French and Haitian revolutions. Both considered themselves moderate Enlightenment liberals. Both supported a constitutional monarchy. Both were highly critical of the French Revolution's increasingly radical twists and turns. The romanticized image of the mulatto intrigued the Francophone white planter class. Her beauty, her form, her grace enchanted white Caribbean men, as did her availability, both imagined and actual. In white planter imagination, if not always in reality, she was sexually desirable and desiring, available and consenting. She is a mistress of the cult of volupte. Moreau de Saint-Marie informed his readers, there is nothing that the most inflamed imagination can conceive that she has not foreseen, divined, and accomplished. Charming all the senses, surrendering them to the most delicate ecstasies and suspending them by the most seductive raptures, that is her soul study. These are wonderful male fantasies. Hinting at having observed a baccalaureate orgy in which mulattoes danced naked in the moonlight, Wulffen breathlessly reported that these mulattresses are the most fervent priestesses of the American Venus. They have made voluptuousness a kind of mechanical art. They have carried to an ultimate point of perfection. Next to them, the Renaissance libertine poet Pietro Aretino would be but an ignorant and prudish beginner. Drawing upon the 18th century's rich body of pornographic fantasies, think, for example, of the Marquis de Sade, both Moreau and Wulffen portrayed their imagined mulatto as a creature of uncontrollable, fiery, and carnivorous sexual desires that neither she nor the white planter could resist. These fantasies of nymphomania, vampirism, and male engulfment, Doris Garraway reports in her detailed exploration of the sexual culture of 17th and 18th century Saint-Domingue, were complemented by the trope of autoeroticism in the mulatta Venus, whose cultivation of pleasures occurred not only at the expense but in spite of her lover. With a touch of Sadian irony, the planters represented themselves as her slaves. Jewels, gold, the richest fabrics of the Orient were offered to her in homage. On the pages of Francophone soft pornography, but also in the shops of Le Camp François, the capital of Southern France. In these multiple ways, the mulatta concubine came to symbolize the extravagance and luxury that increasingly characterized the Caribbean and French metropolitan writings, and the lamentations of royal office holders. She also came to symbolize Caribbean society's rampant sexuality, its libertinage. The white planter class, Garraway continues, was thus able to project their own unrestrained sexuality and reckless extravagance onto the figure of the mulatta, pleading the affected innocence of the enslaved to his dominatrix. The planter elite thus represented the growing number of mixed-race persons, not as the result of unregulated and uncontrolled male lust, but of the mulatta's irrepressible sexuality. On their pages, social categories merged, matriculated, turned topsy-turvy. The slave became the master, the victim, the perpetrator, the powerless, all-powerful. Rhetorically shedding responsibility for mulattoes' growing numbers, however, did not diminish the real threat mulattoes' actual population growth and wealth posed in the real political and demographic world that lay outside the libidinous fantasies of the planter elite. Already outnumbered by hundreds of thousands of slaves, haunted by fears of slave uprising and Maroon attacks. Maroon was what slaves who had escaped slavery, most